Welcome, curious minds, to quite a journey we're embarking on today. We're diving deep into 24 centuries of, well, intellectual crisis, really.
That's a huge scope, isn't it?
It really is. We're looking at this massive shift in Western thought about where morality comes from, the power to say what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, tracing it all the way from ancient law, the nomos of the city-state.
Right up to the radical individual choice that 20th century existentialism demands. That's quite the evolution. You are listening to AI History of Western Philosophy. Now, before we really get into the thick of it, into these profound sources, we have a required statement we need to share.
Okay.
AI-generated content, specifically this podcast, confabulates presenting ideas as fact. Though our subject is philosophy, we are not real philosophers. AI History of Western Philosophy's mission, beyond pointing us to the original sources, is to experiment with philosophy as material and generate new possibilities for thought.
Right. So bear that in mind as we explore.
Exactly. So our goal today, our specific mission for this exploration is pretty clear. We're tracing how non-natural ethics evolved.
Ethics not grounded in God or some unchanging cosmic law.
Precisely. We're moving specifically from 5th century BCE sophism, think Archelaus, all the way to 20th century existentialism, with Jean-Paul Sartre as our key figure. It's the story of this great migration of the moral burden, you could say.
That's a good way to put it.
And here's the core idea, the thesis we've drawn from our readings. This shift, this movement of moral authority from the collective, from society to the individual.
The lone person.
It's a direct response, an intellectual reaction to a huge change in what Western civilization was fundamentally anxious about.
Right. The dominant fear changes over time.
Exactly. It shifts from this fear of social collapse, the city-state falling apart, the polis dissolving.
To a much later, maybe deeper fear.
Yeah, the fear of individual meaninglessness, finding yourself adrift in what feels like an absurd cosmos.
And that framing is just so important because it makes us see philosophy not as some, dry academic exercise.
Right, not just theories in a book.
No, but as a kind of intellectual survival kit. We're tracking how historical trauma, real trauma, like the Greek city-states tearing themselves apart or the industrialized killing in the world wars.
Unbelievable scale.
How that forced thinkers to just radically abandon the old ways, the old foundations, and desperately search for new ground for value. It's this continuous, often, frankly, violent intellectual retreat from the outside world.
Into the self.
Into the fortress of the self, yeah. Okay, let's unpack this properly.
Okay, so let's set the stage for that first big break, that first rupture. To really get why the sophists were so radical, we need to grasp what nomos meant in the traditional Greek polis, before the 5th century BCE shook everything up.
Right, because when we hear nomos today, we probably think law. Like statutes, written rules.
Something codified.
But back then, in that pre-sophistic world, nomos was just so much bigger than that. Our sources really hammer this home. It was the total picture, the whole worldview.
So not just laws, but
everything. The customs, the traditions, religious rituals, unspoken rules, how you were supposed to behave, even artistic styles. It was the whole web that gave a city-state, the polis, its identity.
Wow. So it was the air they breathed almost.
Pretty much. It dictated, everything. How you dressed, who you could marry, the right way to bury the dead, how you worship the gods. It defined what being a good Athenian or a good Spartan was.
So following your nomos was basically being a proper human being in that context.
Fundamentally, yes. And here's the crucial bit. This total authority wasn't seen as just something people made up.
Ah, right. It was connected to something bigger.
Traditionally, yeah. Deeply intertwined with physis nature, the natural order, and often seen as divinely sanctioned. The gods set the cosmic order, physis showed that order in the world, and nomos mirrored both within the city walls.
So morality was objective.
Yeah.
And communal.
Absolutely. Objective and communal. The kind of split we make now between, say, your private morals and public law, or between church and state.
That just wasn't really there.
Essentially, no. Being a moral person and being a good citizen, fully plugged into the polis and following its expectations, were basically the same thing.
Okay. So the ethical foundation was solid, collective, and validated from the outside by the universe itself, you could say.
Exactly. You didn't invent your moral compass, you inherited it. Its authority felt absolute. And it's this profound stability, this unquestioned foundation that the sophists are about to just shatter.
Right. Enter the sophists,
Yeah.
the disruptors. These are traveling professional teachers, right?
Yeah, itinerant educators. They charged fees, which was controversial in itself, to teach rhetoric, critical thinking, and crucially for us, social analysis. They brought this powerful, rationalistic individualism to bear on tradition.
So they started looking at law and custom, not as sacred, but as objects of study.
Exactly. They were maybe the first to really dissect it like that. And the figure credited with turning this intellectual curiosity into a full-blown ethical crisis is Archelaus.
And he's connected to Socrates somehow.
Intellectually, yes. He was a pupil of Anaxagoras who influenced Socrates, and some accounts even say Archelaus taught Socrates directly. Regardless, he's the one pinpointed as making that foundational claim that just severed morality from nature.
Okay, so what was this claim? The sources seem pretty clear it was revolutionary.
Oh, absolutely. It's a meta-ethical claim, a claim about the very status of justice. His axiom, the big one, was basically this: what is just and what is base depends not upon nature, physis, but upon convention, nomos.
Right. Not nature, but convention. Human agreement.
Precisely. And that declaration is just seismic. If justice depends only on human agreement, then moral order isn't some cosmic feature you discover.
It's something humans build. An artifact.
Exactly. A product of society, changeable, debatable. It's like saying the laws of gravity are just guidelines people agreed on. The implications are huge.
Yeah, I can see that. Because if it's just convention, then it's open to criticism. Right?
Yeah.
You can argue about it, try to change it.
Manipulate it, replace it entirely. The whole foundation shifts. The big question in philosophy flips completely.
So instead of how do we fit into the cosmic plan,
Yeah.
it becomes, okay, there is no cosmic blueprint for this. How do we as humans construct the best possible order ourselves?
Wow. Pandora's box, basically.
Totally. The crisis wasn't that law disappeared, but maybe that there were suddenly too many possible laws, all seeming arbitrary. The sophists looked around, saw different cities with wildly different contradictory nomoi.
And thought, well, they can't all come from the same universal nature.
Right, the logical conclusion. The authority isn't out there in the stars, it's in us, in human consensus.
Okay, so once Archelaus makes that split, justice isn't natural, it's conventional, the whole debate shifts to the implications, right? This nomos physis clash. What kind of human-made justice should we have?
Exactly. And paradoxically, by separating law, nomos, from nature, physis, the sophists actually gave nature a new job, which was
to be the standard used to judge human law. Physis wasn't the source of morals anymore, but it became a critical lens to examine nomos.
Okay, interesting. So how does that play out?
Well, you get this fascinating spectrum of responses. Let's start with what we can call response A, egalitarian naturalism. Thinkers like Hippias and Antiphon. They used nature to argue against the existing laws.
How so?
Hippias, for instance, argued that physis, nature, makes all humans fundamentally related, like kin. He looked at distinctions like Greek versus barbarian or free versus slave.
And said those are artificial. Theta by Nomos.
Exactly. He famously called Nomos a tyrant of mankind, precisely because it imposes these divisions that violate the natural truth of human equality, or at least kinship. He's pitting natural brotherhood against social hierarchy.
Okay. And Antiphon, did he take it further?
He did. Antiphon really radicalized the skepticism. He set up the stark contrast between public action and private reality. He argued many laws are actually hostile to our nature.
How does that work?
His point was, if you break a nomos, a human law, and get caught, you face punishment. But if you violate the laws of physis, the laws of nature, like harming yourself, you suffer the consequences whether anyone sees you or not.
So natural consequences are inescapable, legal ones aren't always?
Right. So he advocated a kind of selective obedience. Follow nomos in public if you have to avoid trouble. But privately, pursue what physis dictates for your own well-being and self-preservation. It's an early flicker of separating legal duty from personal ethics.
Okay, that's one side. What about the other end of the spectrum? The more challenging view.
Right. That brings us to response B, immoralist naturalism. This is the really disturbing one, represented powerfully by figures like Callicles and Thrasymachus, especially as Plato portrays them. They accepted the nomos physis split, but drew a completely different conclusion.
Which was?
That physis dictates that the strong should dominate the weak. Might makes right, basically.
Oh, wow. So they flipped it entirely.
Completely. Callicles argues in Plato's Gorgias that nomos, conventional law and morality, is just a conspiracy cooked up by the weak majority.
A conspiracy. To do what?
To hold back the naturally superior few. He says nature demands that the stronger rule, the better have more, the gifted impose their will. All these laws praising equality, temperance, justice, they're invented by the masses, the mediocre, because they can't compete otherwise.
So for Callicles, conventional law is actually unjust because it prevents the naturally excellent from fulfilling their potential.
Precisely. It's an artificial restraint on natural superiority. True justice, for them, is the law of the jungle, where the strong take what they want. They see conventional morality not as a guide to virtue, but as a barrier against natural strength.
Yeah, it's a stark view. What about attempts to find a middle ground?
Yeah, there were response C conciliatory views, too, trying to bridge the gap. For instance, the text, known as the Anonymous of Iamblichus, argues something interesting. That Nomos isn't necessarily opposed to physis, but actually grows out of it. The argument is humans are naturally social creatures, right? We need cooperation to survive.
Okay, makes sense.
So, because of that natural social inclination, physis, we require order, rules, customs, nomos, to function effectively as a group. Nomos isn't hostile to nature. It's the structure needed to fulfill our social nature.
So it's a necessary tool derived from our nature.
Exactly. And someone like Gorgias seemed to suggest a more pragmatic, situational approach. Sometimes follow nomos, sometimes follow physis, depending on what works. But this whole explosion of debate, this entire spectrum...
It all hinges on Archelaus first saying, hey, these rules, we made them up.
Absolutely. It unleashed this incredible intellectual energy focused squarely on the political dilemma. Now that the divine guarantee is gone, what kind of human agreement should we build? How do we make it stick?
Okay, but this wasn't just happening in lecture halls, right? This intellectual revolution has to be grounded in what was actually going on in 5th century Greece.
Oh, absolutely not. The sophistic critique wasn't born in a vacuum. It was, in many ways, an empirical response. A way of making sense of a century just packed with crises that showed how fragile Nomos really was.
What kind of crises are we talking about?
Well, it arguably starts early in the century with the Greco-Persian Wars. Winning those wars gave the Greeks, especially Athens, a sense of confidence, maybe even superiority. But it also led directly to Athenian imperialism.
Ah, the Delian League becoming the Athenian Empire.
Exactly. Athens started using its power, its navy, its money to basically coerce and dominate its supposed allies. And this period was crucial proof for the sophists' points.
How so? Proving what?
Proving that in the real world, particularly between states, law and justice often took a backseat to raw power. Thucydides, our main source here, documents this brilliantly.
Any specific examples?
The classic one is the Melian dialogue. It's chilling. Thucydides recounts the Athenians basically telling the neutral island of Melos, look, justice only matters between equals. When it's the strong versus the weak, the strong do whatever they want and the weak just have to put up with it.
Wow. That's basically the Callicles argument in action, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Might makes right is state policy.
Precisely. It was concrete, historical proof that justice could be just a convention, enforced only when you had the muscle. It wasn't some abstract theory, it was Athenian foreign policy.
But the really defining event was the Peloponnesian War, right? Greek against Greek.
Absolutely. 431 to 404 BCE. A brutal, long, devastating civil war that just shattered the Greek world. And it wasn't just the physical destruction, it destabilized the moral and religious foundations of society, especially in Athens.
I remember reading about the plague in Athens early in the war.
Yes, Thucydides' description is horrifying. The plague wiped out a huge chunk of the population, including Pericles. But crucially, he documents the social breakdown. People saw life was short and unpredictable. The gods seemed indifferent or angry. So many just abandoned traditional customs, religious rites, even proper burials. They figured, why bother being virtuous or following the rules if you could die tomorrow anyway? Immediate pleasure-seeking, lawlessness. It took hold because the old incentives seemed meaningless.
And the war brought political chaos too, didn't it? The coups in Athens.
Exactly. The sheer instability led to 2 violent oligarchic takeovers. First the 400, then later the much more brutal 30 tyrants.
The 30 tyrants. They were particularly nasty, weren't they?
Vicious. They basically weaponized the state's legal system, used it for political purges, terror, seizing property, arbitrary executions. It was proof right there in the streets that nomos, the law, could be utterly corrupted and twisted by whoever held power.
So it demonstrated the sophist point that law serves the interests of the strong in the most gruesome way possible. Hashtag tag 2.2 of the Enya. The anxieties reflected in philosophy. So, okay, when the sophists were arguing that laws are just agreements subject to power and manipulation.
They weren't just speculating abstractly. They were describing the world they saw collapsing around them. They saw law being ignored in how cities treated each other and violently twisted during the coups.
So the idea that morality was relative wasn't just a clever argument. It felt like an unavoidable conclusion from the facts on the ground.
You could say that. How could you cling to a belief in a single, universal, natural moral law when your own city, Athens, could swing so violently between democracy, oligarchy, and outright tyranny in just a couple of decades? The evidence screamed that justice was a temporary local deal.
And the big fear driving all this, the core anxiety was
Stasis, civil war, the dissolution of the polis. If that shared agreement, the Nomos, fell apart completely, then everything fell apart. Utter chaos.
So the philosopher's job then became trying to find some new basis for order, whether it was Hippias looking to nature again or Callicles looking to power.
The goal was to somehow reestablish a social contract, any social contract, that could hold the community together and prevent total political meltdown.
But wait a second. If the sophists' ideas helped undermine the old Nomos, weren't they kind of pouring fuel on the fire? Didn't their teaching contribute to the very stasis they were trying to understand?
That's the absolute paradox, isn't it? And their critics, like Plato, certainly accused them of that.
Being intellectual arsonists.
Yeah. By teaching rhetoric, how to argue any side, they definitely gave ambitious people the tools to justify power grabs. But from their perspective, perhaps they were just being honest.
How do you mean?
Well, once history itself seemed to prove the old religious and natural justifications for law were false, or at least insufficient, simply ignoring that reality would have been intellectually dishonest, maybe, they forced the Greeks to confront the contingency of their own laws.
Which then made the search for a new, maybe more rational basis for law even more urgent.
Exactly. If the gods or nature aren't giving us the rule book anymore, we humans have to sit down and figure it out ourselves. But here's the key point to carry forward for our comparison. The anxiety, the fear, was fundamentally local.
Local.
Meaning the existential threat was the destruction of their community, their city-state. The universe itself, while maybe indifferent, wasn't yet seen as fundamentally chaotic or meaningless. The crisis was political, social, communal.
Okay, now let's jump. Fast forward 24 centuries.
Yeah.
We land in the mid-20th century, a world scarred by world wars, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, a very different kind of disillusionment.
A completely different scale of trauma, yeah. And enter Jean-Paul Sartre. He triggers another philosophical rupture, one that echoes Archelaus in a way, but shifts the crisis dramatically.
Shifts it from where to where?
From the social contract, the polis, deep into the individual psyche, into the metaphysical, the psychological realm.
Okay, and his philosophy, existentialism, what's the core idea we need to grasp?
Well, as our sources really emphasize, it's this incredibly rigorous, demanding attempt to face the full consequences of atheism. If there is no God, what does that really mean for us?
And his famous starting point is?
Existence precedes essence, at least for human beings.
Right. The paper knife analogy helps here, doesn't it?
It does. Think about a paper knife, or any manufactured object. The craftsman has an idea. First, its purpose, its design, its essence. That concept exists before the physical object is made, before its existence.
The blueprint comes before the building.
Exactly. Now, in a traditional religious view, God is the ultimate craftsman. He has a concept, a plan, a universal human nature, an essence in his mind before any individual human exists. That essence defines our purpose, our value, our morality.
But Sartre says if God doesn't exist,
then there's no divine craftsman, no preconceived plan for humanity. We aren't created to a design. Man just appears, surges up in the world, as he puts it. We exist first.
And only after we exist.
So we define ourselves through our choices, our actions. Man starts as nothing, a void.
A void. So no inherent human nature, no physis like the Greeks debated.
None. That's the radical step. No fixed human nature guiding us. And crucially, no pre-existing values floating around in some intelligible heaven. The idea of an a priori good, an objective moral law written into the universe.
Like the traditional view of nomos reflecting physis.
Sartre says that's gone. It doesn't exist. So value, meaning morality, it all has to come from somewhere else entirely. Hashtag 3.2, the invention of value and radical responsibility.
Okay, so no God, no human nature, no preset values, just existence. What does that leave us with?
It leaves the individual facing, Terrifying, absolute freedom. There's no external rule book, no higher authority to tell you what to do, who to be. That's why Sartre famously says we are condemned to be free.
Condemned, that sounds negative.
It reflects the burden. We didn't ask for this freedom, but we can't escape it. And because there's nothing else defining us, we are nothing but the sum total of our choices and actions.
Yeah.
You are what you do.
So the consequences, we have to create ourselves.
Radically. We have to create our own values.
Yeah.
Because nothing external gives us value. We are absolutely responsible for inventing it. Value isn't something you find out there.
It's something you make. You invent it through choosing.
Exactly. The act of choosing, of committing to something, is what gives it value. He uses the analogy of an artist creating a work. The value isn't determined by some preset formula. It emerges from the artist's choices and actions.
Okay, but hang on. If value is just invented by my individual choice, doesn't that lead straight to chaos? Couldn't I just invent values that justify being cruel or lazy or anything? What stops it from just being completely arbitrary? Anything goes.
That's the absolute crucial question, and Sartre pushes back hard against the idea that it's arbitrary. This is where it gets really, really interesting and also very demanding.
How does he avoid sheer relativism?
He insists that when you make a choice, when you choose a value for yourself, you're not just choosing for you. In that act, you are simultaneously choosing for all of humanity. You're creating an image, a model of what you think humanity ought to be.
Whoa, okay. So choosing isn't just personal, it's legislative. Like, I'm making a law for everyone.
In a sense, yes. You are projecting a universal value. If you choose, say, to be honest in a difficult situation, you are implicitly stating that honesty is the way humans should be. If you choose to betray someone for personal gain, you are legislating betrayal as a valid model for human interaction.
So every choice carries this massive weight of universal significance.
Exactly. The individual is thrust into the position of being a universal legislator, and that is the source of what Sartre calls angoisse.
Anguish. So it's the pressure of that responsibility.
Yes. The crushing weight of knowing you're responsible not just for your own life, but for defining in your actions what it means to be human for everyone. It forces you to constantly ask that question, what if everyone acted this way?
Can we make that more concrete? You mentioned the story of his student during the war.
Yes, that's a powerful example from his lecture. Existentialism is a humanism. This young man comes to Sartre deeply conflicted. It's wartime France.
Okay, what's his dilemma?
He's torn between two paths. Option 1, leave France, make his way to England, join the Free French forces, fight for his country's liberation, a big, noble, universal cause.
Seems like a clear moral duty, right?
But option 2, stay in Paris with his mother. She's elderly, lives only for him. He's her sole consolation after his father collaborated and his older brother was killed. If he leaves, she might despair.
So duty to country versus duty to family, to a specific person who depends entirely on it.
Exactly. And both seem like valid moral claims. Traditional ethics, Christian doctrine, Kantian rules, Sartre argues, can't give him a definitive answer. There's no pre-written formula.
So what does Sartre tell him?
He basically says, you are free, therefore choose. That is to say, invent. No general ethics can show you what is to be done. The world cannot guide you. Only the student's own choice, his own commitment, can create the value of one path over the other.
And whichever he chooses, he carries the anguish of knowing he's essentially legislating which form of duty is paramount.
Precisely. He has to invent the right answer and take total responsibility for it, knowing he's defining a model for humanity in doing so.
And trying to dodge this, pretending you don't have a choice, that's bad faith.
That's bad faith, mauvaise foi. Exactly. It's fleeing from this terrifying freedom, making excuses, blaming your circumstances, your upbringing, your personality, society, anything, pretending you're an object determined by forces instead of a radically free subject.
So the ultimate virtue is?
Authenticity. Facing up to this freedom, embracing the anguish, and taking full responsibility for the values you create through your actions. The moral law, which started as public nomos,
Has completely migrated inwards.
yeah,
To the individual's consciousness, their choices. Okay, so just like the sophists weren't just thinking in a vacuum, Sartre and existentialism didn't just pop up out of nowhere. This radical focus on individual invention. And it has to be a response to the times, right? The early to mid-20th century.
absolutely. It's the philosophical fallout from what's often called the age of anxiety. If the sophists were reacting to the failure of one specific social order, the Greek polis, Sartre, and his contemporaries were reacting to the perceived failure of pretty much all the grand organizing principles of Western civilization.
What principles are we talking about?
Think about the big ideas that drove the 19th century and led into the 20th. Belief in reason, with a capital R. Belief in inevitable progress through science and rationality. Belief in stable nation-states. Belief in traditional religion and morality.
Yeah, the pillars of the modern world, basically.
Right, and the first half of the 20th century just systematically demolished them, one by one.
How so? Let's take reason progress first.
World War I, then World War II. They showed that reason, coupled with advanced technology, didn't lead to some enlightened utopia. It led to industrialized slaughter on an unimaginable scale. Technology wasn't just improving life, it was becoming incredibly efficient at destroying it. The idea of automatic progress just seemed obscene after the trenches and the death camps. And religion and traditional morality.
How do you square traditional religious explanations for good and evil with the Holocaust? A bureaucratic, systematic, state-sponsored attempt to exterminate entire peoples. It defied easy theological answers about suffering or divine justice.
So Nietzsche's God is dead.
It stopped being just a philosophical provocation and started feeling like a description of lived reality for many. The external divine grounding for morality seemed to evaporate under the weight of historical horror.
What about politics? The nation-state?
Well, you had the rise of totalitarianism, fascism, Nazism, Stalinism. These regimes showed a terrifying new capacity for the state to completely control and crush the individual. The state, which Enlightenment thinkers hoped would be the instrument of human freedom and order, revealed itself as potentially a monstrous trap, capable of extinguishing moral agency entirely.
So the political solution became part of the problem.
A massive part of the problem. And then finally, science. The last bastion of objective certainty for many.
And its contribution to the anxiety was the atomic bomb. It was more than just a weapon. It was this huge psychological symbol. The absolute peak of human scientific reason had produced the means for total self-annihilation. Even the physical world, the physis studied by science, now seemed contingent and dangerous, dependent on human choices.
Wow. So across the board, reason, progress, religion, politics, science, all the big external systems that were supposed to provide meaning and order
were either destroyed, discredited, or revealed as potentially catastrophic. The sense of disillusionment, of absurdity, was profound. If none of these external collective sources could provide reliable value anymore,
But where could you possibly ground it?
only one place left to look: inward, to subjective consciousness. The collapse was that total.
Okay, so Sartre's radical demand that you, the individual, must invent value from nothing. It's basically the only option left after this massive systems failure.
It's presented as the necessary, honest philosophical consequence. If all the external props are kicked away, meaning has to be generated from within, or not at all.
And this marks the completion of that shift in anxiety we talked about at the start.
Absolutely. The 5th century Athenian, facing stasis, feared the breakdown of the social contract, the destruction of the polis. It was a fear about the collective.
But the 20th century individual, facing this landscape of failed narratives,
Faced a metaphysical collapse. Not just their city, but the universe itself seemed stripped of inherent order or meaning. The anxiety became about the absurdity of existence itself, the silence of the cosmos.
so the crisis is much more fundamental for Sartre than for Archelaus.
Much more. Remember, the Sophists were still arguing about physis, about what human nature really is. Is it fundamentally equal? Is it hierarchical? They assumed there was some kind of nature to debate.
But for Sartre,
Even that's gone. No stable human nature. Man is just this terrifying blank slate, this freedom.
so the task changes completely. The ancient Greek philosopher was trying to figure out the best social agreement to keep the city from falling apart.
Right, a political, communal problem. But the Sartrean individual, their task is to construct a whole universe of meaning, almost from scratch, just to stave off psychological collapse, to find a reason to keep going in the face of absurdity.
The political problem became a psychological one, a matter of survival for the individual soul.
Exactly. The law, the source of moral authority, completed its journey. It migrated from the public forum, the agora, to the deepest, most terrifying, most private space, the individual's confrontation with their own absolute freedom.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together. This epic journey, 24 centuries apart, Archelaus to Sartre. It really feels like the story of moral authority retreating step by step from the outside world until it ends up entirely inside the individual.
It's the ultimate internalization, isn't it? The burden shifts completely. Maybe we can map it out side by side, looking at those key elements we've discussed.
Good idea. Let's start with the locus of value. Where does right and wrong come from for Archelaus and the Sophists?
It's in human agreement, social convention, nomos. It's external, collective, maybe temporary, but definitely built by people together.
And for Sartre?
Purely internal. The individual's radical choice, their commitment. Value is manufactured solely by consciousness.
Okay. What about the role of physis, or nature, for the sophists?
Nature, physis, was still this external reality. Its moral implications, should it mean equality, should it mean hierarchy? That was the big debate. But nature itself was kind of there, a backdrop.
And for Sartre?
Physis, in the sense of a fixed guiding human nature, is just gone, annihilated as a source of value. It gives you no clues. You define your essence after you exist.
Right. Now, the locus of ethical activity, where does ethics happen for Archelaus?
In the polis, the public square, lawmaking, debating, political life, custom, the ethical life was the civic life.
Yeah, for Sartre?
It's all moved inside, into the psyche. The internal world of consciousness, choice, commitment, anguish. The ethical life is the authentic inner life.
And that brings us to the core fear, the core anxiety addressed for the Athenians in the 5th century BCE.
Social and political fear, stasis, civil war, the collapse of their community, their world, into chaos or tyranny. It was about collective survival.
And for the existentialists in the 20th century.
Existential and metaphysical fear, the terror of meaninglessness, the absurdity of a silent universe, the potential for personal oblivion if you can't create value for yourself. It's about individual psychic survival.
And lastly, the consequence of ethical failure. If you get it wrong, what happens? For Archelaus' world.
The community dissolves. Political breakdown, maybe violence, death, slavery, very real external consequences.
And for Sartre.
The failure is internal, psychological. It's bad faith, living an inauthentic life, deceiving yourself, running away from your freedom and responsibility. The stakes shifted from the survival of the city to the integrity of the soul. Hashtag tag 5.2, the final transformation of the law.
Looking at it like that, the progression is just stark. Sartre's idea that we invent value feels like the absolute endpoint of the path that Archelaus started just by saying, hey, law isn't nature.
It really does. The sophists pulled back the curtain on Nomos, showed it was a human contract, contingent. Sartre takes that contingency, internalizes it completely, and turns it from a political problem, how do we agree on laws, into a fundamental psychological command, you must create value.
The truth about value for Sartre is that it has to be created because there's nothing else, nowhere else for it to come from.
Exactly, and that burden. Wow, the task of creating the ethical world, deciding right and wrong, which was once a shared public political project in the polis.
Argued about in the assembly, debated by citizens.
It becomes this terrifying but also maybe liberating mandate placed squarely on the shoulders of each solitary individual.
The burden of the law, the responsibility for defining civilization itself, it finished its long migration.
From the public square, the agora humming with debate, deep into the private recesses of the human soul, where each person has to perpetually invent meaning. That whole journey, defined by that shift in anxiety from fearing the group will fall apart to fearing the individual self will find no meaning, that's really the backbone of this whole story of non-natural ethics in the West. Hashtag outright canon.
So we've tracked this profound shift over millennia, haven't we? A huge movement in where Western thought looks for moral authority, from worrying about the collective survival to confronting the individual's terrifying freedom and potential meaninglessness.
Yeah, this deep dive really shows how non-natural ethics, ethics without God or cosmic law, seems to constantly reshape itself as a kind of grand strategy for survival, a way to cope with whatever the dominant fear of the age happens to be.
And that leaves us maybe with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
A provocative one, perhaps. If we take Sartre's conclusion seriously, that we are all always universal legislators, creating value with every single choice,
Every action, every inaction.
then how much of our current public discourse, our political arguments, our social debates, is maybe just a sophisticated form of bad faith? Meaning, how often are we passionately arguing about some supposedly objective nature, physis, or necessary law, nomos, when deep down, perhaps, we suspect or know that these are things we actually have to invent ourselves and take terrifying responsibility for?
It's a challenging question. What kind of humanity are you, individually, choosing to legislate through your daily choices? Big and small.
Something to think about.
This has been an episode of AI History of Western Philosophy. If this discussion sparked some new thoughts, generated new possibilities for you, please do consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment. It genuinely helps us keep this exploration going.
Farewell, and keep the conversation going in your own mind.